Okay, we're doing Justice Then, Justice Now. We're doing the podcast now with Paul Pelletier. Paul is an attorney for many years. I've known him since the 1990s. We had a case that will be further explained with Evelyn Bazone Papa and Carlos Romero Paez, and that he is very relaxed tonight, and we share a lot in common. There are a few discrepancies that we have, but we're Boston sports fans. And we're here to talk about his career and cases that he had that were very unique to Miami, and also when he went up to Washington, prosecuting people there, and served at the Department of Justice for many years. And now he's in private practice. And I'm glad, and I'll use the word loosely, honored to have him on the show, because this is something we want to do. And his legal expertise is A+++ with that. So I'll let Paul explain. Jeff will probably ask the layman questions. So anyway, good evening.
Good evening, Toby. Thank you for having me on. Good evening, Jeff.
So, Paul, I know we had like an hour-long interview, like 6 months ago. But this, I think, is going to air before that. So maybe if you could catch all of these viewers up on just where you're from, where you're from and what got you to the start of your career.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm from Massachusetts, like Toby. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts in the 60s. And I, like Toby, was a delinquent as well, I'm sure. And when I graduated while I was going to college, I ended up joining the Dighton Police Force, which was my hometown. I was a cop for a bit on the Dighton Police Force while I was going to college. And I was not the favorite to be hired of most of the police officers, because most of them had chased me during my formative years growing up. But anyway, it was a very interesting experience, and it helped me through both college, and then I went to law school. I was a bartender and waiter through law school. Really wanted to do public service, use my law degree to do public service, and hopefully as a prosecutor. I was fortunate enough to have done well in law school. I got 2 judicial clerkships, a trial clerkship and a appellate clerkship at the Colorado Supreme Court. Absolutely loved all of it. I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to be a federal prosecutor. And like most of the federal agents and prosecutors you'll talk to, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make the biggest difference I could through public service. And I was fortunate enough to get a job in the tax division of the Department of Justice. I got rejected my first 2 applications to them while I was doing my clerkships. I sent a letter telling them they were making a big mistake by not hiring me. And I got an interview finally, and I got hired in the tax. It was a wonderful, wonderful job. By virtue of being in the tax division, it was before money laundering was a crime. So before money, and believe it or not, there was a time before money laundering was a crime, and that was any time before 1986. So I started in the tax division in 1984, and because drug trafficking was a huge problem in Miami and in Southern Florida, I got sent down there from the tax division. And one of the ways we would seize money back then without any really adequate money laundering or asset forfeiture laws, when we found money on drug traffickers, we would assess their tax liability right there, right that day. And we would collect half of it as penalties and taxes, and we would take it away from them. And they were entitled to a trial before a judge within 48 hours of that. So it was fast and furious. We would take money from drug traffickers, and we would assess their liability immediately. We called them jeopardy assessments. And we would take their money, and they would get a hearing in 48 hours. Most people didn't want to have a hearing because they didn't want to actually testify about how they got the money. But many times we took the money that was earmarked for attorneys, and the attorneys would fight for it. And so I started my career in the Department of Justice fighting attorneys in South Florida who were taking money from drug traffickers, and for the most part, winning all of them. One of the attorneys I went up against was a guy by the name of Mel Kessler, who went by the name Dirty Mel Kessler because he was a dirty lawyer who was ultimately convicted. But he was one of the first people that I went up against because I seized money in an envelope that had his name on it. So that's how I got my teeth into South Florida. I loved the judges down there. I loved the action down there. It was an absolute crazy, crazy, crazy time. It was probably complete anarchy. And it was in 1986, it was settled down a little bit because the money laundering laws came into effect. The sentencing guidelines came into effect. The minimum mandatory laws came into effect all at the same time. The Rule 35 came into effect where only the government could move to reduce sentences, which gave prosecutors incredible power to reward people who cooperated up the chain, which was essential to taking out entire drug trafficking organizations. And it was just a fantastic time to be in Miami. So what I decided to do is leave the tax division and join the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami in 1988, late 1988. That's how I ended up in Miami.
So like, if you're a defense attorney and you're fighting for drug money, is there any stigma attached to that? Or like, do you kind of get put in a group?
In 1984, 85, and 86, there was zero stigma attached to that. It wasn't even illegal to launder money back then. So people were proud to do it. As Toby can attest, there was so much money sloshing around from defendants to attorneys. It was crazy. And one of the things I did once I got safely ensconced in Miami, as I made it my mission to prosecute defense attorneys who were laundering money. And that's because it was a crime, number one. Number two, I perceived it to be part of the problem down there. And number three, I recognized that if you prosecuted one criminal defense attorney, it would reverberate around the country. And so it would have a tremendous impact both on what we did as prosecutors and on the business of drug trafficking. So I sort of made it a specialty of prosecuting criminal defense attorneys and encouraging my fellow prosecutors to do the same. I wasn't invited to a lot of defense attorney parties back then, nor was I invited to any dinners. And I was probably one of the most hated prosecutors in Miami by the defense bar, but it was a unique opportunity to make a difference by actually showing no fear and going after criminal defense attorneys.
Let me ask a quick question because this is something historical I don't know. And if you could explain it. Paul, when did the Nebia hearings come into effect for counsel as far as clients paying and they would, whether or not the money was tainted?
All right. So a Nebia hearing, for those who don't know, it is a hearing named after a person named Nebia. And that came in the after money laundering became a crime in 86, to the best of my knowledge. I didn't become a criminal prosecutor until 87, 88, actually. But a Nebia hearing is where if a person wants to post money for a bond, then they have to prove that the money they're posting for a bond came from a legitimate source. And that was a Nebia hearing. We used to have plenty of those. And quite frankly, another thing that came into effect in 1986, I told you that the entire dynamic changed in 1986. Up until 1986, the criminals and the drug traffickers were in charge. They were absolutely in charge in South Florida. In 1986, because of the money laundering laws, because of the sentencing guidelines, because of the minimum mandatories, because of Rule 35, meaning only prosecutors could reward cooperation through a reduction of sentence. Because before 1986, defendants could move to reduce their own sentence. In 1986, they couldn't anymore. And finally, what I didn't mention before, The Bail Reform Act came into effect in 1986, where if you were charged with a drug trafficking crime that warranted a sentence of 10 or more years, you were presumed to be a danger to the community and a risk of flight. Therefore, you were detained pending trial. And being detained pending trial, which didn't happen before 1986 very often, was a unique way to baptize drug traffickers immediately with the consequences of their behavior and make them recognize that they're going to be sitting in jail from the day of their arrest to the day they're released upon the service of their sentence, which typically in Miami was somewhere between 10 and 30 years. So it gave them an incredible incentive to cooperate. And of course, only we could reward that. We as prosecutors could reward that cooperation with a sentencing reduction. An absolute sea change in how we dealt with crimes, criminals, and drug traffickers in South Florida. It allowed us, as both federal agents and prosecutors, to literally take charge of the drug trafficking organizations.
So all this stuff happening in 1986 or around then, is it everything just kind of coincidentally happening at the same time, or is it a concerted push by like a group of people to achieve a common goal?
So it's a great question. It was when Congress used to work. So it was literally people all working together, law enforcement, Congress, sentencing commission, all working together to see how they could fix a problem of lawlessness, which had basically, Miami was ground zero. Everybody knew that. And so it was everybody pulling their oars together, Republicans, Democrats, everybody doing what they needed to do to take control of the situation, which ultimately, as Toby can attest, it was an incredible toolbox that we were given.
And when you're going after one of these lawyers, obviously they're probably going to fight harder for themselves than they will for any other client. Is it like big game hunting for you? Is it like way harder than just getting a squirrel off your fence?
It is way, way, way harder. Why? Because number one, lawyers, when you charge drug traffickers, they know it's part of the business, right? They know that if they get caught, that's it. Lawyers don't expect to be defendants for participating in their activities of facilitating drug traffickers. So you're literally, these are people that are the upper echelons of their community. They are people that, go to sleep at night thinking that, number one, they're never getting caught, but that they haven't done anything wrong for the most part, or they conceal what they do wrong from their family members. And it is some of the most difficult street fighting I was ever engaged in. It's very difficult. I would have bar complaints filed against me consistently. Bar complaints are when they file complaints seeking to take away my license for doing what they say is illegal things or unlawful things or improper things. So I spent a lot of time fighting bar complaints to keep my license. It was a very, I'm not going to say unrewarding, because in the end it was very rewarding, but very challenging time as a prosecutor. And it was something that me and a team of prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office circled our wagons around, and we persistently did it. I think we convicted about 5 ex-AUSAs in our endeavors, but it was a movement.
And what kind of like punishment would these guys get generally?
Oh, they would get substantial penalties depending on what they were charged with. But the money laundering laws, typically were very tough on people. They had a maximum sentence of 20 years, so you could sentence people to a long time. Jerry Remy, one of the lawyers that I prosecuted and convicted, he got 17 years. I mean, you could get a lot of time. Most of them got around 5, sometimes 2 or 3. But remember, 2 years for a lawyer, you lose your bar license, you use your ability. I mean, it is a long time. But I've gotten everywhere from 2 to 17 years from for criminal defense lawyers who are convicted.
Wow. So after 1986, did the type of people who represented drug dealers change?
Well, Miami was always unique in terms of the defense bar. In Miami, it was a lot of individual lawyers who hung out their own shingle, former prosecutors, former public defenders, and they would hang out their own shingle. That was something unique about Miami. A lot of big cities that you go to, it's law firms that represent criminal defendants, even in the drug business. But Miami, it was a lot of individual people. So when you said, did the quality of lawyer change? No, but we did change the dynamic extensively and demonstrably in a drug trafficker's ability to pay lawyers with drug cash. We changed that dynamic incredibly.
So maybe like the super high end ones wouldn't maybe want to take the risk or couldn't be rewarded,
Or they would ask the court before they would take money, they would ask the court to sort of bless the legitimacy of the money, which was a difficult thing to do when you're representing a drug kingpin or a cartel leader. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're in Miami, Toby's in Miami. Where did you guys first cross paths?
I think it was in a bar.
Tobacco Road, probably.
Hey.
It was where they had beer specials and all that.
Local gin joint. But no, Toby was obviously known to drug prosecutors in Miami. We would, I had a fabulous experience with both the DEA, with Customs, with FBI, actually. They were tremendous in the drug arena. It was just a unique time in Miami where all resources really came together. And we used to hang, I don't see it happening today, but we used to drink with agents. We would play softball with agents. We would hang out with agents. It was a fantastic atmosphere in which everybody sort of was uniquely positioned to, number one, hang out, but really make a difference in the drug arena in South Florida.
Yeah, I'm sure you had so many cases that it's probably a blur for most of them, but what's like one that sticks out in your mind that you're the most proud of or the most unique or the craziest?
There's a little bit, there was, God, that's a good question. It's a lot. Probably the one that I would say is the most unique. I mean, I would tell people that that every conspiracy in Miami and drug conspiracy involves all the same people, right? Because these organizations, these drug trafficking organizations, would share people all the time, right? They had different leaders, but they would share people all the time. And I prosecuted this one organization in Miami was particularly prolific, and we called it the Alex DeCubis Organization. And we had, it was fairly unique because it was the first time that we had used a FLIR, which is a forward-looking infrared camera, to videotape at night off of the Bahamas and offload from a freighter of about 4,000 kilos. And we actually videotaped the whole thing from a Coast Guard helicopter that was sort of very quiet. It was it was one man. It was sort of like these little airplanes you see, which is just one guy in it, and there's a thing. So it was very quiet, although if you got close enough, you could hear it. But it was the first time we ever in South Florida had videotaped through a FLIR camera the offload of a freighter of cocaine, and then we watched it as we sort of splintered off. I ended up, along with my friends in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami, we ended up indicting about 200 people in this organization, both importers and exporters. but we never got our hands on Alex DeCubis, who was sort of running the importation end of it in Miami. He was a sort of a local hero. He was a wrestler at Palmetto High School, and he was featured in Sports Illustrated. And he's a heavyweight wrestler. And so I had my focus on him for a while, tracked him all around the world, through Brazil into Colombia. Took me 14 years, but we got him 14 years later. But in the meantime, we ended up arresting a whole slew of other people. Seized the yacht, seized the freighter, the Nirma, which is a huge coastal freighter that would actually do freight, but they would put the cocaine in the holds of the ship to hide it, in the ballast tanks to hide it. So when Coast Guard would come on board, they wouldn't have to check the ballast tanks, and that's where it was. And they had brought in before this 5 other loads at 4,000 kilos apiece. So it was a pretty major organization. And it was run out of Barranquilla by this kingpin of the North Coast cartel by the name of Julio Nasser David. So we traced, like everything else, it's like putting a puzzle together to look back on sort of how the organization ran and who was involved. And that's how we sort of historically went back and indicted 200 people and convicted virtually every single one of them. But we found out that the Nirma was purchased for $1.3 million by 13 $100,000 cashier's checks bought at UBS in Panama. And this was before they had arrested, this was 1987, it was before they had arrested Noriega. So if you may or may not recall, once Noriega was a problem, all of the financial institutions moved out of Panama for a bit. But Panama was the sort of the Western financial capital of the world. They were the Switzerland of the West, and all the banks moved out pretty much when they became a drug trafficking haven under Noriega. So I subpoenaed. I put out extradition warrants. That's what it was, for Julio Nasser David and his wife in Switzerland, because UBS had moved all of his money back to, we presumed, back to Switzerland. Well, as luck would have it, they arrested in Switzerland this guy by the name of Casper Duno, who was a chauffeur to Julio Nasser David's wife, Shayla, in Switzerland. And I'll bring all this story together for you in a minute, but it's just sort of how things worked. So the Swiss magistrate called me and said, you have an arrest warrant. And by the way, we're not supposed to talk to foreign judges or stuff like that. We have an Office of International Affairs that's supposed to go through them, but I didn't care about that stuff. So he called me and said, we have a warrant, international arrest warrant for Julio Nasser David. Are you still interested in him? I said, yeah. And they said, well, we've arrested the chauffeur to his wife here in Switzerland. And I said, yes. I said, we believe he has money in Switzerland. I've sent some MLAT requests over there. MLAT is a mutual legal assistance treaty request. And so he said, well, you don't have the name of the right account on the MLAT request. And I said, well, I'm not surprised there. I don't know what the name of the account is. He said, well, you have to figure that out. So we fooled around, and I had no idea what the name of the account was, I guessed. And he would tell me, Swiss bank secrecy is a very important thing over there. They don't do anything. So he would tell me when I was getting warm. And finally, he said, close enough. And he said, well, I won't seize the accounts now, because in order to forfeit any money he had over there, we had to have a live defendant in court to forfeit the money. in Switzerland. And I had no live defendant. I hadn't even indicted his wife yet. So I said, give me time to charge his wife. And of course, I'm not supposed to have any of these conversations with him. Give me a time to indict his wife. And I said, but will she be free to spend it while this process takes place? He goes, yeah, of course. I said, well, Jesus, I don't want her spending the money. He said, look, don't worry, it's going to be hard for her to spend all the money in there. And I said, how much money is there? He said, I can't tell you. So anyway, I put together a case against her, which was fairly difficult. And so ultimately, we indicted her, he arrested her, and I said, is the money secure? He said, yes. I said, tell me how much she spent. He goes, 7 million. I go, oh my God, you're kidding me. He goes, don't worry about it. He says, there's 200 million left in the account. I said, oh my God, that's unbelievable. So we seized the money, brought it all back to the United States. At the time, it made the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest drug cash seizure ever. But it's just sort of how things worked in Miami. You know, any case could have turned into that.
So where does that 2 million go?
200 million.
I mean, I'm sorry, 200 million. Where does that 200 million go?
Goes into the big black hole of the U.S. Treasury, but a lot of it. Well, first of all, we had sharing agreements with Switzerland. They kept half of it, so the 100 million came here, and law enforcement shared a great part of it. I think I gave 13 million to the Boca Raton Police Department, and they built a huge center. They put radios in the Monroe County Sheriff's Department put radios in all their cars with the money. So it was a boon to local law enforcement. It really helped them. Some of the agencies that helped us with the case, it really helped them build up their law enforcement resources to tackle these problems that we had in South Florida.
So were you able to kind of?
Can I comment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The asset forfeiture.
By the way, Toby, before you get in there, none of it went to me, and that's my biggest chagrin.
But were you at least able to kind of like, influence where it went?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, the U.S. Attorney's Office is a big part of allocations to law enforcement. Go ahead, Toby. I'm sorry.
We had, the asset forfeiture unit started to form at Treasury, like Paul said, in the Marshals in 1986, 87, with that law developed forfeiture units that strictly worked on getting these seizures from Switzerland. Is in the book, we talk about the Paul Hindeling case, which was an old DEA case, which was adopted by Monroe County Sheriff and Customs. And it ended up with about $100 million in the Isle of Jersey and all over the place in Switzerland. And the going rate, Paul's correct, is half. So the money that went to the sheriff's office in the Keys, they ended up getting a brand new updated police station in Marathon, like equipment and stuff like that. It was like a windfall for them. So it went from the drug dealers into what Paul said, and the U.S. attorney recommended on that panel to get that stuff forfeited to them. So anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries.
That's funny, Joe, because the Paul Hindelang case was an offshoot of the Nasser case.
I know that.
So because of the Nasser case, we found the Paul Hindelang money. Paul Hindelang was famous a little bit famous because he invested in cell phones in California and phone booths in California when it was something. And so he took his drug money. He was a marijuana trafficker for Julio Nasser David's organization, and he would bring in barges of marijuana into South Florida, into Louisiana. And so because of the Nasser case, we were able to find his money in Switzerland. But what was unique is that he parlayed his money and invested it in this cell phone and phone booth business in California and quadrupled his money. And because he used drug money to infiltrate that was all seized. And we found that because of Julio Nash David. And so I'm not even talking about that money. That case produced all that. Another fun fact of that case, Paul Hindelang was the business partner of a guy who was running for governor of California. I'm blanking on his name right now, but because of this case, and because of the fact that they linked the business partner to Hindelang, he lost the race for governor, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected instead of him. And so when news of this came up, it sabotaged his campaign, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was the beneficiary of that. But that's the Paul Hindelang case linked directly to the Julio Nasser case, and that was all that money was shared at the same time. I think it was ultimately $240 million total.
So just those two cases, like $500 million.
Yep, $250 million.
Well, 200 plus
Quarter.
200 plus 240, right? Yeah.
It was
Right.
really it was really about $240 million total.
Yeah. Oh, gotcha.
Wow.
So yeah,
Today's standards, that would probably be over $1 billion. Easy.
but yeah, and then we got some more money. I mean, the beauty of these cases is you grab one case, you follow it, and it bleeds into another case. And if you're savvy enough, you can just work these cases forever, forever. And so anyway, every case was interesting. Every case was like that. Prosecuting lawyers was fascinating as well. I mean, as Toby can tell you, every case in and of itself is fascinating.
Wild times.
So did you find the other money when you were guessing for the original one? Was it that same Swiss bank account?
You mean the Hindelang money?
Yeah.
Oh, so what happened? What happened in reality was when we found the Nasha money, the magistrate who was working the case, the Swiss magistrate, and they were prosecutor magistrates, so they were both prosecutor and judge. It was fabulous, and so he said, the evidence you sent me also leads to other accounts over here. And that's how we got into that. I assigned one of my prosecutors that worked for me, Rich Byrne, to the case. I said, go for it. He went for it. And it was just fascinating. Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. And it developed. It was, I talked about the politics internal with customs, and we sent a bunch of people over to the Isle of Jersey. And when I met with Rich Byrne, he came in and he said, we can't get any action from customs. And I was kind of a guy who went against the grain with headquarters occasionally. And I said, Rich, we got a detail. We're going to staff it for 3 months over there and that. So, and I said, as a matter of fact, I got money for you guys to go. Hugo Black too, who's deceased, but was a great prosecutor, and paid for the whole trips to get it. Now, it sounds like this was not a vacation. This was the Isle of, and I went over myself. I kind of had an interesting, I went there, and the next day I was detailed to 9/11. I did my business there, and next thing I know, I'm in New York City. So that's the kind of running and gunning that we did with customs. But so they went over there and we had it, I was talking to people at headquarters, and they're like, how much do you need? And I said, maybe 200,000. And they're like looking at me with two heads, because it was going to be asset forfeiture money in the pool up there to fund the trips for the U.S. attorneys and the agents to do this. And then I said, it's 250,000 and $100 million. Okay. All right. You think you can staff it? And they did, so.
Very cool. So where'd you go after Miami?
Well, I went from the drug unit in Miami to the economic crime unit in Miami, and I started doing healthcare fraud prosecutions. As you probably know, Miami was the ground zero for healthcare fraud. And quite frankly, the truth of the matter is that in the mid 90s, particularly 97, when when extradition became permissible again in Colombia, where we could extradite cartel leaders, the cartels literally stopped doing business in Miami and moved their business almost entirely, and in South Florida, and moved their business entirely to Mexico. It was just the cost of doing business in South Florida became to be too much because agents like Toby and other agents did such a terrific job in our office, did a really terrific job in driving up the cost of doing business for these guys. And so they literally in the mid 90s, they moved all operations through Mexico and mostly through the southwestern states, California and New Mexico and all that. So drug trafficking as an opportunity to prosecute really went way down in South Florida, literally. And so the next big thing was a lot of the drug traffickers moved into the healthcare fraud business because it's a lot easier and safer, and you can involve your whole family, and the checks come from the United States government, so it's a much safer and better business. So so I started doing. They put me in charge of the economic crime unit in Miami. We had one health. I'm just giving you sort of how I transitioned out of drugs to the economic crime unit and into DC. So I ran a section, the economic crime section in Miami. It was 20 attorneys. I interviewed all the agencies as to what the issues were in South Florida then in 1997. Almost invariably, everyone said healthcare fraud. So I came back, and we had 1.5 prosecutors assigned to healthcare fraud in South Florida, which was absolutely fucking ridiculous. So I told 10 of the prosecutors in the unit, you are now healthcare fraud prosecutors. None of them wanted to be. I didn't give a shit. Half of them left the unit, which is fine by me. I replaced them with new people that were healthcare fraud prosecutors. And we started to tackle healthcare fraud in a very significant way in South Florida, like it had never been addressed before. I mean, we're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars being stolen from our public fisc on a monthly basis. And so I ended up building what's called the Healthcare Fraud Investigatory Center in Miami, it was actually Miramar, which was a place where the FBI, HHS, OIG agents and the U.S. Attorney's Office could go and both store evidence and investigate and prosecute cases. Huge success. We ended up understanding the data because remember, in healthcare, Medicare is a government agency and they house all the data. So we could look at the data and see the trends and see where the fraud was moving to and what type of fraud was going on just by looking at the data. So we got the agencies to all share data, and we began targeting significant organizations before they stole all the money. Because most of the time in Medicare, it's pay and chase. The CMS will pay the fraudsters, and then we have to chase the money. And once the fraudsters get it, it's very difficult. So our desire was to grab the money. First case we prosecuted in South Florida, we saved the government. The government was spending $1 billion a year just in South Florida on infusion therapy. After we used this data to prosecute all the relevant individuals, billings went from $1 billion a year to $30,000 a year because it was all fraudulent. So it was very effective. I did that for 5 years. Got a call from Washington. They were prosecuting Enron. Actually, at the time, they were prosecuting Arthur Andersen. They wanted to build up the fraud section of the Department of Justice to be sort of a fighting machine. They asked me to come up there and participate in teaching prosecutors how to fight white collar crime efficiently and effectively. I went there in 2002 during the Enron scandal. Ended up being the acting U.S. attorney over Enron during the Skilling and Lay trial. And then I prosecuted white collar cases from 2002 to 2011 when I left the Department of Justice.
I'm just curious real quick, like what's a typical healthcare fraud scheme?
Well, there's no such thing as a typical healthcare fraud scheme.
Well, I'm saying like maybe what was like the easiest, like lowest hanging fruit, like the easiest to identify, maybe most common.
So what we would do, there are all kinds. The ones that started in Miami, the ones that were sort of the thing that everybody did in Miami was DME fraud. So it's durable medical equipment, right? So durable medical equipment is equipment like a wheelchair, an arm brace, anything that's a piece of medical equipment. And they would have shops set up all of an electric wheelchair for $7,000. And the typical fraud is you collect Medicare patients, and for some reason, Florida has a bunch of old people that are willing to sell their Medicare number, and you recruit patients, and you sell them devices that they never get, and you never give it to them, but you pretend you do. And so there's no actual transaction happening. And then, so that's sort of how typically it started. The first case I prosecuted when we opened up the Healthcare Fraud Investigatory Center, they had what was called an inhalation machine scam, where, as you know, older people with COPD have to breathe through a machine, and the drugs are administered through the breathing machine. And this is all, it wasn't until 1996 that Medicare paid for drugs. That's Part D. And so, but before that, if the drug was administered through a piece of durable medical equipment, then they would pay for it, and only then. So the scam at the time was, because the scam already was oxygen, right? I'm pretending you need oxygen. So I'm going to sell you monthly oxygen. And of course, you don't need it and you're not receiving it. It's all bullshit. So you're billing for that. Well, now you got COPD and you need to get some sort of drug in your system, like, those little spray things, atomizers. Oh, now you need that delivered at night through a piece of machinery. So we took down 50 people who were 3 pharmacies who were whipping up these drugs in their back rooms, which, by the way, the drugs are produced by medical companies. You don't need to whip them up in your back room, but they were, quote, mixing them like alchemists in their room, like pharmacies used to operate with a mortar and pestle. Anyway, it was because people didn't need them. So they were just manufacturing garbage. They were delivering some of the shit. They weren't delivering others. And they were billing as if it was real stuff. And it was literally hundreds of millions of dollars. So that was the forced organization I took out. 3 pharmacies, a whole bunch of clinics, and a whole bunch of patients. And so we took those out. There was, I think, 42 people were in our first indictment. So that's it. But that's also the case where I learned about the data, because when I said to them, so they were billing for this drug called acetylcysteine, and I'm like, what the fuck is acetylcysteine? And they said, well, that's a drug that's used to dislodge thick mucal plugs in cystic fibrosis patients. And 90% of those drugs are being billed in Miami. And we have less than 7% of the cystic fibrosis patients. So it has to be a scam. I'm like, why aren't we doing this all the fucking time? Using the data to figure out where the frauds are.
There's a legit paper trail.
Yeah. And so And then we used the data to go after infusion therapy, which I told you was an AIDS therapy that wasn't used, but they were billing $1 billion a year. And then when I went to DC, I said, let's do this all across the country. So we started establishing healthcare fraud strike forces in certain areas where it's high profile fraud, using data to target the fraud. And literally, in our first year of putting strike forces in, where we taught them how to do this. And by the way, fucking U.S. Attorney's Office weren't prosecuting any of this shit, right? There were people who were stealing tens of billions forever. So, and most of them didn't want us there because we were proving they weren't doing anything. But now we have strike forces in 13 cities around the country, and they routinely save taxpayers over $100 billion a year. And most of these districts didn't want us fucking there. And we had to force our way in there. So it's a wonderful thing, and the data tells a story. And then what we did when we went into DC is we started using that data to focus on other types of white collar crime, particularly crimes that happen in the banks. In other words, banks are selling certain stocks or whatever they're selling, and we use data to track sort of through the CFTC where the trading was fraudulent. And so we use the same model that proved efficient to go after trading, the traders at certain banks and financial institutions. And so it's a model that if the government had half a brain, they would continue and to use throughout the world, throughout the country to tackle elite white collar crime.
I mean, like, are all
Fun
these
shit.
are all these type of things like prosecuted similarly? It seems like you have to be an expert
Yes.
in every single type of thing. Like, how was it on the job training, or were you just intellectually
100%
curious enough to know about everything? Like, how the hell?
True answer to that.
100%. It's all opportunistic, right? And it's all organic, right? So for all fraud's the same. It's lying, cheating, and deceiving. You just have to prove they're lying, cheating, and deceiving, right? So one of the things about our model that we did is you didn't need to have a witness. You didn't have to cooperate. Didn't need a snitch. I could prove from the data that you didn't have that shit to sell, and all the money ended up in your pocket. And so we convicted a number of people early on without a freaking witness who said this guy's involved in the scam, because we could put all the money in their pocket from the scam, which we could prove with a scam. So, almost always you want someone who's going to flip and say this is a crime. But on many occasions, we would prosecute without a cooperating witness who said that guy's the bad guy, because we would prove it was a complete scam and all the money ended up in Mr. Big's pockets. So fuck him, convict him, and invariably the jury would. So it's, yes, you have to know how to harness the data. And we had this wonderful lady named Peggy, who was a former nurse, who taught all of America now how to look at the data, how to analyze it, how to focus upon it, and how to use the data to track where the crimes are happening. And that was novel, but I did it because I had someone like Peggy to help me do it. And I had, the FBI gave me money, Health and Human Services gave me money. And, it's just being in the right place at the right time, too. A lot of it is. But also being a little bit inventive and understanding how crime works and how criminals work.
What was like the most rewarding? Going after those lawyers, or going after the banks, or going after healthcare fraud?
It's all reward. See, to me, what's rewarding is the impact you can make, right? When I take out an entire organization, not when I say me, it was, I had a team, right? I had agents, I had fellow prosecutors. I don't mean me. When we are able to take out an entire organization, a drug trafficking organization, put them out of fucking business, that's rewarding, right? And seize all their money, that's rewarding. When we can go after healthcare fraud organizations and fucking disembowel them and save taxpayers billions of dollars, billions of dollars. And not because Washington, D.C. tells us how to do it, because we tell them how to do it, right? We're on the ground. We're telling them, this is fucking how you do it. I mean, the FBI came to me in Washington, D.C. and said, Miami's not working anymore. Can you strike force Miami and go back there? I said, no, but one of the things we can do is use that as ground zero to put strike forces around the country. And I got my people in Washington, D.C. to support me. So it's a lot of people supporting. I hired my healthcare fraud deputy from Miami. I hired him into Washington. So and all at every turn, people are saying yes in the government, empowering me to do it. That's very important. And so that's satisfying. And then when you save taxpayers $1 billion, that's satisfying because that money goes back to the elderly for healthcare services, right? And then finally, when we moved on from that and went to Wall Street to put, the CEO of two CEOs of insurance companies, major AIG, General Reinsurance, to put them in jail, to put CFOs in jail because they're ripping off investors. That's rewarding, right? So there's all kinds of rewards all around. And it wasn't until the leadership in DOJ wouldn't let me do that anymore that it became very unrewarding. So for 25 years, every day was the most rewarding day of my life, right? And then you have the Eric Holder, Lanny Brewer group, where we have the largest economic fraud in the history of America, and they allow us to prosecute 0 people. That's when it became very unrewarding.
So was that a turning point in your career?
Yeah, I quit.
It's quite a turning point. So what'd you do after that?
Mm-hmm. I ran for Congress and lost. And then I worked for a law firm, and now I have my own firm, which is also rewarding.
I'd love to ask about your FBI agent career on Me, Myself, and Irene. One of my favorite movies ever.
All I can tell you is that
came out of left field.
I was FBI agent number 4, and the director gave me the nickname Scribbles because he said I wasn't taking notes. I was actually scribbling, and it looked ridiculous on the movie script. So my name, he called me Scribbles.
I mean, I think I could talk to you, Paul, until the Red Sox win their next World Series.
Oh, they lost. They lost tonight.
They went a long time without the 1918 to 2004.
I'm just saying that's how many questions I could probably come up with, but I'll have mercy on you this time since you already agreed to be a repeat guest at some point in the future. So we got to leave some meat on the bone. Toby?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I can see that. And I also see the Red Sox. So I'm not going to argue with that. We're pretty much on the same team. Thank you, Paul, for coming in. And like I said, we're going to we got such a spectrum of people on this. It's unbelievable. I can't even tell you. We just started filming the last 2 days, and it's great to end today's with you because it's all going to fit in. And, maybe some of the individuals you'll recognize that are on there, but I don't know. That's what's going to be a surprise to me too. But
I think if I think what you guys are doing is great. And I think that ultimately there's a whole, we're talking about just completely the law enforcement side here, but there's also a human side to all of what we do and what we did. And I think, we didn't really explore that tonight, but I'm happy to explore that at some point as well. And, some of the rewarding stuff, not as rewarding, but some of the rewarding stuff is, some of the people who I convicted and sent to jail for 30, 40, 50 years. One of them was 50 years, would literally send me Christmas cards every year. And you get a chance to change people's lives too on an individual level. It's not always that way. I mean, some people are hardened criminals, but I very proud of one guy that I got 50 years. He ended up helping on a lot of very significant cases. I helped him get a sentence reduced to 30 years, and he's a productive member of society now. And he was a really bad guy, a really, really bad guy. But, he kept in contact with me, and, I don't hold grudges, and, I just do my job. And so there's a human side to all of this.
Absolutely. And then we're going to have some of those people on, and, your experience with that, with the Rule 35s that he explained and that came into effect, really, really can give people an opportunity, clemency, pardons and all that come into play. It's if they prove themselves in society or in prison, they deserve a second chance. Thank you for coming on tonight. And let's see. Yeah, it's almost my bedtime. So
It's much later than you promised.
I know. Tobacco Road, that's the key. So we'll settle that up. Thank you, Paul.
All right.
Thank you so much,
night.
Paul. Looking forward to the
Thanks,
next one.
folks.
All
Take care.
See you.
Likewise.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.